There are certain silences in marriage that no one prepares you for, the kind that doesn't stem from anger or fatigue, but from a subtle disconnection you can't quite name. My husband and I weren't fighting. We didn't raise our voices. We still had dinners together, shared jokes, even touched hands across the table out of habit. From the outside, we were fine. Better than fine. We were that couple people looked at and quietly admired, stable, successful, unshaken. But there's a kind of emptiness that lives not in absence, but in repetition. I could recite his daily schedule by heart. I knew when he would call, what he'd say, how he'd say it. Predictability had become the language of our intimacy. And somewhere along the line, I stopped feeling truly seen. He still reached for me at night, but it was mechanical. Polite, like ticking off a box. There were no words, no questions, no lingering, no attention to the way my body breathed or didn't. I found myself looking in the mirror longer than I used to, choosing my clothes with more care, not for him, for something. I didn't yet understand when the message came that my stepfather was flying in from Portugal. I felt an unfamiliar rush. Not joy exactly, more like static across the skin. I hadn't seen him in years. He wasn't part of my daily rhythm. He belonged to another time, another version of me, one who still believed feelings could consume. My mother and he had divorced when I was 20, but we'd always kept a kind of quiet connection. Holiday calls, short notes, the occasional forwarded article. He was the type of man who noticed things most people overlooked. Gestures, moods, how a sentence ends. The idea of him standing in my kitchen again, speaking in that slow, observing way of his, sent something warm and unwelcome coiling in my stomach. My husband, always practical, offered to pick him up from the airport. "You haven't seen him in forever," he said. "Why not invite him to stay the weekend?" I nodded, feeling the floor tilt slightly under me. When he arrived, it was raining. The kind of soft, persistent drizzle that makes everything look cinematic. He looked older, of course, but still had that posture. Shoulders back, gaze steady. He hugged me like someone measuring the space between past and present. "I almost didn't recognize you," he said. I smiled. That's what time does. He brought a bottle of wine from Lisbon and stories that stretched across countries. And years. At dinner, he listened more than he spoke, letting my husband carry the conversation. But his eyes found mine across the table when I laughed, and something old flickered between us. Something I hadn't felt in years. Awareness. Later that night, after dishes were washed and my husband had retreated upstairs with a spreadsheet open on his laptop, I stepped out onto the back porch. The rain had stopped, but the air smelled like wet bark and cool earth. He joined me silently, handing me a glass of wine. "You always liked the quiet," he said. I nodded, fingers curling around the stem. "I still do, I just forget sometimes." He didn't say anything for a while. Then, "You look tired, not just physically." That caught me off guard. My husband never said things like that. He complimented my work, my ability to manage, my efficiency. But tired? Tired implied someone had been watching. "I am," I said finally. "But it's the kind of tired that doesn't go away after sleep." He turned to me, his gaze steady. "I know that kind." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a confession. It was recognition, and it hit me deeper than any compliment ever had. We stood there like that for a long time, in a silence that felt both dangerous and honest. When I finally went upstairs, my husband had already turned off the light. I undressed slowly, folding my blouse with unnecessary care. I reached for a nightgown I rarely wore, softer fabric, lower neckline, and caught myself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at me wasn't chasing anything, but she wasn't content to be still either. As I slid under the covers, I felt the weight of his presence still lingering on my skin. Not my husband's, but his, not from touch, but from something quieter, more magnetic, and I knew without admitting it that I would find another reason to be alone with him before the weekend ended. The next morning, I was more deliberate than usual. Not with dramatic gestures, just small, precise decisions. I showered longer, letting the water cling to my skin. Until my fingertips softened, I chose lingerie I hadn't worn in months. Black lace, understated but snug in the right places. Not because I expected anything, not because I was trying to seduce. I told myself it was for confidence. But confidence? For what? He was already downstairs when I entered the kitchen, barefoot, towel still wrapped around my head. He glanced up from his coffee. There was no comment, no prolonged stare. Just a simple acknowledgement of my presence. And yet I felt it deeper than 1,000 words. We moved through breakfast with the ease of practiced strangers. My husband had left for work early, citing a meeting downtown. The quiet in the house felt thicker without him. My stepfather sat by the window, reading something on his phone, his glasses perched low on his nose. I poured myself coffee, but my hands were clumsy, awkward in a way I hadn't been in years, as if I were suddenly 17 again and seeing him through a different lens. "You always preferred mornings," he said, not looking up. I paused. "Not really anymore, but today feels different." That was the first crack, the first moment we admitted, even indirectly, that something was shifting. Around noon, I offered to show him the garden. He agreed, and we stepped out into the still wet yard, sunlight catching on the grass in sharp glints. Everything looked more vivid than it had in months. The lavender bushes had bloomed again. I hadn't even noticed. He moved slowly, more thoughtful than I remembered, pausing to touch leaves, to smell herbs. I watched him with a kind of distant envy. How he managed to engage with the world without rushing through it when he stopped. In front of the small bench beneath the cedar tree, I joined him, sitting a little closer than necessary, not touching, just close enough to feel the edge of his breath when the wind shifted. He spoke about his time abroad, about places that sounded impossibly alive, markets in Morocco, slow drives through Tuscany. A week in Kyoto he described like a memory out of someone else's book. I listened, but my attention kept catching on the curve of his wrist, the steady rhythm of his voice, the space between his words. At some point I asked, "Did you ever feel like you missed something by not settling down again?" His eyes turned toward me, not sharp, but unfiltered. Of course. But I learned to make peace with the version of love I could carry. I don't know what made me ask. "What kind was that?" He didn't answer immediately. "The kind you don't always name, but you remember it long after it's over." Something in my chest tightened, a pressure I hadn't felt since I was a girl, unsure whether it was longing or guilt or hunger. Back inside, the air felt heavier. I busied myself in the kitchen. Not because there was anything to do, but because I needed something to hold. He came in behind me. I could feel his presence before he said a word. "You seem distracted." I turned around slowly. "I feel like I don't know what I'm doing anymore." We stood close, closer than people should when there's so much history between them. He didn't touch me, but his eyes asked permission I didn't know I'd already granted. The first kiss wasn't expected. There was no build-up. No music, no lingering glances. It was quiet, brief, but devastating in its clarity. His lips brushed mine, firm but hesitant, and for a second, the world outside that kitchen ceased to exist. I didn't stop it. I didn't step back. I just stood there, breath caught in my throat, as if my body had remembered something I'd spent years trying to forget. When we pulled away, there was no apology, no excuse, only silence, charged and dense. "I should go rest," he said. Barely above a whisper, I nodded. "Of course." He left the room and I remained, one hand still on the counter, eyes locked on the empty coffee cup between us. My heart thudded too loudly in my chest, but my body wasn't trembling. I felt awake, and not in the way coffee or daylight wakes you, but in that dangerous, electric way that shifts the air in a room before a storm. I stayed there for minutes, maybe hours, until the sun bent low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. I didn't cry, I didn't smile, I just waited. For what? I wasn't sure. Maybe for the guilt to set in, but instead, all I could think about was the feel of his mouth, and how it wasn't nearly enough. That evening, the house felt altered. Not visibly, nothing was out of place, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Like a painting slightly askew on a wall, I walked through the rooms slowly, as if they could betray me with the memory of what had happened in the kitchen. The counter was wiped clean, the windows closed, the wine glasses from lunch rinsed and left to dry, nothing to point fingers, nothing that could be named, and yet everything felt changed. My husband came home just after 7. He kissed me on the cheek, asked if I'd eaten, and commented on the smell of rosemary in the hallway. I answered, nodded, made all the right sounds. But my body felt foreign. My skin held warmth I hadn't. Earned with him, I avoided his eyes for most of dinner, choosing instead to refill our water glasses, fold napkins neatly, and ask questions I didn't care about the answers to. Across from me sat the man I'd married, the man who still wore his wedding band without hesitation. He was thoughtful, attentive, predictable in every way I'd once craved. But now, every time his voice reached me, I heard what it lacked. Not cruelty, not coldness, but depth, risk, curiosity. He asked if I'd taken the car in for service, if I'd remembered to email the neighbor back. My mind, uninvited, flashed to the sensation of someone else's breath just inches from mine. I excused myself early under the guise of a headache upstairs. I lay on the bed fully dressed. Staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slow, hypnotic circles, I replayed the kiss more times than I could count. Not just the moment itself, but the stretch of silence afterward. The weight of everything unspoken. I hadn't felt that particular kind of pull in years, not since before marriage began to reshape desire into routine. The next morning, I dressed with even more intention than the day before. I chose a soft blouse with delicate buttons down the front and tucked it into a narrow skirt that cinched at my waist, not overt, nothing vulgar, but I knew exactly what it did to my shape. I lingered in front of the mirror longer than necessary, tilting my head slightly, catching how the sunlight touched my collarbone. My body, once something I'd dressed for comfort or function, had become a whisper I wanted. Someone to hear? I found him outside on the back porch, mug in hand, eyes trained on something in the distance. He didn't hear me approach, or maybe he did and didn't turn. When I finally sat next to him, he spoke first. I thought you'd be avoiding me. His tone was light, but his fingers gripped the mug just a little too tightly. I shook my head. That would be easier. But easier's never really been my thing. He nodded once, the corner of his mouth twitching like he wanted to smile but thought better of it. We sat in silence for a while, the morning birds performing their usual concert just beyond the trees. I could feel him watching me from the corner of his eye, and I knew my outfit hadn't gone unnoticed. I'm not going to apologize. He said eventually, I didn't expect you to. Are you regretting it? I exhaled slowly. No, but I haven't figured out what to do with it yet. He didn't press. That was the difference between him and every other man I'd known. He could sit with the discomfort, let it breathe. He didn't try to cover it with logic or laughter, he just allowed it to exist. Later that day, I suggested we take a drive into the city. Nothing far, just a break from the house. I told my husband we needed some things from the home goods store. He didn't question it. He never did when I sounded organized and domestic. The drive itself was uneventful. Music played softly from the dashboard, and I kept both hands on the wheel, not because I needed to, but because I didn't trust what would happen if I didn't. We didn't talk much on the way. The city loomed. Ahead, its skyline sharper than I remembered. It was a weekday, so traffic was kind. I parked near a small bookstore cafe I hadn't visited in years, the kind of place with cracked leather chairs and chipped saucers that made everything feel deliberately lived in. He raised an eyebrow but followed without question. Inside, we found a booth in the corner. I ordered chamomile tea. He asked for a black coffee, no sugar. When the drinks came, we let them cool untouched for a long time. It was in that booth that something more dangerous than a kiss happened. Honesty. I used to think you saw too much of me, I said, stirring my tea though. I never added sugar. He tilted his head. Too much? Back then, when you lived with us, you made me uncomfortable because you noticed everything. Most men look through women. You didn't. And that made you uncomfortable? At the time, yes, because I didn't know what to do with it. He leaned back slightly, letting the words settle. And now? Now I miss being seen like that. We didn't touch. Not even across the table. but it felt more intimate than anything I'd shared in my marriage in years. On the drive back, I could feel the air between us thicken with restraint. Every red light felt longer, every bump in the road sharper. I gripped the steering wheel too tightly. He looked out the window as if the trees could offer clarity. By the time we pulled into the driveway, dusk had started its slow descent. The porch light was already on. I turned off the engine but didn't move. "You'll stay for dinner?" I asked, my voice too even. He nodded. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." I didn't say that. We stepped out of the car, still carrying everything we hadn't said. The front door clicked shut behind us, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Something irreversible had begun, and neither of us was going to stop it. Dinner that. Evening was quiet in the wrong ways. Not peaceful, not tired, just composed. A manufactured calm that barely concealed the heat flickering beneath it. My husband took the head of the table as always, carving the roasted chicken with his usual efficiency. He made small comments about traffic, deadlines, someone in his office who kept forgetting attachments. I nodded at all the right moments, passed dishes, offered him wine. I'd done this routine 1,000 times, but that night, every movement felt like walking a balance beam. Across from me sat my stepfather, folding his napkin with the slow deliberation of someone buying time. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his words were careful, even-toned, giving nothing away. His eyes met mine only once across the table. Brief, unflinching, sharp enough to slice. I looked down quickly, pressing my thumb to the base of my wine glass to ground myself. If my husband noticed anything strange, he didn't show it. He thanked me for the meal, told me the sauce was especially good, and then, like always, excused himself to take a call. Upstairs, the moment he disappeared, the silence in the dining room took on weight. I stood to start clearing plates, and my stepfather rose at the same time, brushing his hand against mine as we reached for the same bowl. It was a nothing gesture. Innocuous, except that my skin ignited like a struck match where he'd touched me. In the kitchen, we moved in sync, barely speaking, exchanging dishes and glasses without needing to choreograph it. Every second stretched tight with tension, like the kitchen itself was holding its breath. When the faucet hissed, it startled me more than it should have. I dropped a fork. He caught it before it hit the floor, his fingers brushing my wrist. Again, that invisible spark. "I should go to bed early tonight," I said, not looking at him. His voice was low, almost unreadable. "Probably a good idea." I turned off the light and left the kitchen without saying goodnight upstairs. I didn't undress right away. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same edge I'd occupied every night for over a decade, and listened to the muffled hum of my husband's voice from the office across the hall. He was on another call, probably about numbers, deadlines, logistics, things he could control, things that made sense to him. I finally stood and unzipped my skirt, letting it fall in a silent puddle at my feet. The lace I wore underneath, black, again, felt like both armor and confession. I stood in front of the mirror, not for vanity, but for proof. I wanted to see the woman who had been kissed in the kitchen, who had trembled in the car, who had ordered chamomile tea and admitted to missing the feeling of being seen. And she was there, not ashamed, not elated, just alive in a way she hadn't been in years. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. My husband came into the bedroom while I was still dressing, holding his phone with that slightly distracted smile he wore when he was about to make a proposal I wouldn't like but would probably accept. "I have to go upstate next weekend," he said. "Conference, 2 days." I nodded, pulling my blouse down over my hips. "Okay." He paused, watching me. "Why don't you come with me? It'll be boring, but at least it's out of town." I forced a smile. "You said yourself it'll be boring. What would I do?" "Sleep, order room service. You could use a break." That word, break, stung more than it should have. I almost laughed at how neatly he'd packaged my exhaustion. Maybe. "Let me think about it," I said, brushing past him toward the bathroom. Closed the door behind me and turned on the faucet to drown out my breathing. He meant well, I believed that. But his efforts arrived too late. Like watering a plant after it's already withered to dust, He was trying in his own way, but he still didn't see me. Not really. When I came downstairs, I found my stepfather reading at the kitchen table. He looked up, and something in his expression shifted. We didn't greet each other, didn't ask about sleep or coffee. We didn't need to. The air between us already carried every sentence we hadn't dared to speak aloud. "I want to take a drive today," he said, folding the newspaper. "Away from here, just for a bit." I looked over my shoulder, instinctively checking for the sound of footsteps upstairs. "Where to?" He shrugged. "Somewhere the phone won't ring?" It wasn't the words that moved me, but the weight in them, the quiet plea for space, escape, something beyond these walls and routines. We didn't tell my husband. I said we were picking up groceries. He nodded absently, already typing something. Into his phone. The drive was aimless by design. We headed west. Through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, then into open stretches of green where the trees arched like cathedral ceilings overhead. We found a small road I'd never noticed before. Unpaved, rough, lined with wildflowers and fences long abandoned. It led to a crumbling lookout point that overlooked a dried-out creek bed and a stretch of forest goldening at the edges. He parked. We didn't speak for several minutes. The air smelled of pine and dust. I rolled down my window, the breeze carried. The weight of late summer thick and slow. "This is better," he said. I turned toward him. "Then what?" "Then pretending this isn't happening." My pulse pounded in my throat. I looked down at my hands, folded too tightly in my lap. He reached over, not with urgency, not with force, and touched my wrist. "I'm not trying to push you, I just want to know I'm not the only one who feels this." "You're not." The words felt like opening a gate I'd held shut with my whole body. He moved closer, just enough to see my face more clearly. "I don't want to lie. But I can't pretend either. I'm tired of silences." And I, God help me, understood that more deeply than anything he'd ever said. When we kissed again, it wasn't sudden or accidental. It was deliberate, conscious, measured. His hand rested on my cheek, steady, warm. Mine curled around the fabric of his sleeve. We stayed like that, mouths barely touching, breath shared, longer than seemed reasonable for a moment so fragile. And when we pulled apart, I didn't feel shame. I felt certainty. But I also felt time ticking. I knew we couldn't sit there forever. I knew this car, this road, this day, none of it would wait. So I leaned back in my seat, eyes on the windshield. "We should head back." He nodded once. No arguments, no complaints, but the silence that followed us on the way home wasn't empty anymore. It was full of knowing. And it was only a matter of time before someone else would know too. Back at the house. Everything resumed its shape as if nothing had happened. The door closed with its familiar weight. The hallway lights hummed softly, casting their usual golden warmth on the floorboards. The sound of typing drifted down from the upstairs office. My husband was exactly where I'd left him, locked in the neat, compartmentalized world he trusted. Numbers, charts, meetings, everything had a place, but my body no longer belonged to that order. I excused myself and went upstairs to change. Not because I needed to, just because I wanted. A moment to stand alone in the dim light of our bedroom, staring at my own reflection. I didn't undress all at once. I peeled each layer carefully, as though I were examining what parts of me still belonged to the woman I had been a month ago. A week ago, even this morning, there was something deliberate in how I chose my new outfit. Not overly sensual, not careless either. A deep burgundy blouse with an open neckline, sleeves rolled up just enough to show the curve of my forearms. Slim dark jeans, no jewelry. I left my hair loose, tucked behind one ear. I didn't want to look dressed up. I wanted to look like myself, but the version of me I wanted him to see. When I came back downstairs, my husband was still in his office, now on a video call, headphones pressed to his ears, voice low and contained. I passed by the door without pausing. I didn't knock. He didn't notice. The kitchen was empty. My stepfather wasn't there. I found him outside on the back patio, sitting on the wide wooden step just beyond the sliding door. A cup of coffee cooling beside him, untouched. He was looking at the trees like they might answer a question he hadn't yet asked aloud. He didn't turn when I slid the door open. Didn't speak. I sat next to him without a word, leaving enough space for air to move between us, though I could feel the pull of him like static. "I dreamed about you," he said suddenly. His voice was quiet, not confessional, just real. What kind of dream? The kind where I wake up and still feel it. I stared ahead, watching a single leaf spin down from a high branch. My hands were folded in my lap, my thighs were pressed together, my heart beat low, steady, louder than it should have. I think about you more than I should, I admitted. He exhaled slowly, as if that gave him permission to breathe. And what do you do with that? I wear it under my clothes, I said. Everywhere I go. The air shifted after that. The light dulled, as if even the sun had paused to listen. I stood and walked down the 2 steps onto the lawn, needing the distance, needing to feel my feet on something real. He followed a second later. We walked in silence toward the garden path, past the sleeping rose bushes, past the little bench beneath the cedar tree. It was here, in this quiet patch of late afternoon, that everything broke open again. I don't remember which of us moved first, only that his hand found my waist, fingers, steady through the fabric of my shirt, and that I leaned forward at the same time he did. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't sweet. It was something entirely different. A collision of withheld want, anchored in the knowledge that this wasn't supposed to happen again, and that it would. The kiss wasn't like the first one. It was deeper, slower, more certain. He pulled me closer, and my fingers tightened around the back of his neck, feeling the rough edge of stubble, the warmth of his skin. I could hear my own breath. I could hear his. I could feel everything we hadn't said pouring into the space between us. There was no rush to stop, no gasp of guilt, just the strange, beautiful quiet of 2 people finally allowing themselves to feel without boundaries. When we pulled apart, we didn't speak for a while. I stayed close to him, head against his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heart. He touched my hair, smoothing it once. "We can't keep doing this," he said. But there was no weight behind it. "I know," I whispered. But I also knew I didn't want to stop. Not yet. Not when I'd just started to feel like my body belonged to me again. Not when someone finally noticed how I moved, how I breathed, how I slowed my steps when I didn't want to leave. Later that evening, we sat through dinner with my husband. Just the 3 of us. As if nothing had happened in the garden. I passed the salad. He poured the wine. My husband asked what we thought about repainting the kitchen cabinets. We both nodded, answered in turn. The choreography was flawless, and yet I could feel the electricity beneath the table. Our knees didn't touch, but I knew if they did, I wouldn't move away. After the meal, my husband went to the den to watch something he'd recorded. I stood in the doorway with a dish towel in one hand and watched the 2 men in my life living under the same roof, breathing the same air. One of them loved me out of loyalty. The other wanted me because he couldn't help it. It was the cruelest kind of intimacy. In bed that night, my husband touched my shoulder. His fingers were light, tentative. I turned to him, not out of obligation, but because I needed to know. Needed to remember what this was supposed to feel like. He kissed me. I let him. But my body didn't answer, not in the way it used to. My mind drifted to the garden, to rough hands on my waist, to kisses that burned and lingered. I closed my eyes. Let the moment pass. In the darkness, I understood, something that chilled me. I wasn't afraid of getting caught. I was afraid I wouldn't. The following days unfolded with deceptive calm. I performed my roles like clockwork, preparing meals, replying to emails, folding laundry with unshakable precision. I kissed my husband when he left for work and asked about his day when he returned. From the outside, I was the same. Inside, something fundamental had been rearranged, like furniture in a room I could no longer navigate in the dark. My body carried a memory that wouldn't fade, and worse, it didn't want to. Every part of me still remembered the pressure of his hand. At my waist, the deliberate slowness of his breath, the warmth between his fingers and the small of my back. These weren't just moments. They had become sensations that stayed with me like perfume on skin. I felt them in the quiet of the afternoon, in the stillness before sleep, in the absence of everything else. He didn't initiate anything after that second kiss. Neither did I, not physically. But we orbited each other constantly, in the way his gaze lingered when I walked into the room, in how I found reasons to be alone in the garden or the laundry room, places he might also happen to pass through. There was an invisible thread stretched tight between us, humming with tension. It wasn't neediness, it wasn't romance, it was recognition. Then came the shift I hadn't anticipated. My husband, without warning, began to notice me again. Not in grand ways, not in declarations or surprises, but in small, unsettling acts of attention. He brought home my favorite wine one evening, unprompted. He offered to take me to the art exhibit I had mentioned in passing weeks ago. At night, he kissed me more fully, held me for longer. Once, I woke in the early hours to find him simply watching me, his hand resting on my hip like he was trying to relearn its shape. Part of me wanted to let him. Another part, the part that had reawakened under someone else's touch, remained still. It was during breakfast on a Thursday that he said it. "You've been distant lately." The spoon in my hand hesitated above the yogurt bowl. "Just tired," I replied. "You're not just tired, you're somewhere else." I didn't answer. He didn't push, but I felt it in the room after that, an awareness creeping in, slow and invasive. My husband was noticing the cracks. Later that day, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and didn't recognize the expression in my own eyes. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was conflict. A layered, aching thing that refused to settle. My marriage hadn't broken. My husband hadn't betrayed me. He was still here, still kind, still trying, in his structured, quiet way. But that was part of the problem. I hadn't been trying. I hadn't been fighting to reclaim us. I had surrendered too easily to the pull of something that made me feel alive, even if it was wrong. That night, my stepfather and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen again. The house was quiet. My husband in the living room with his headphones on, absorbed in some documentary. I was rinsing dishes and he was drying them. Our hands moved in practiced rhythm, but the air between us was heavy. He placed a plate on the rack and spoke without looking at me. "I'm leaving Sunday." My chest tightened. "Where?" "Back to Lisbon. My apartment's still there. I have work waiting." I turned off the water. The sink gurgled once before falling silent. "You didn't mention anything before." He finally looked at me. His face was composed, but his eyes weren't. "I didn't know until this morning. Got an email. I said yes before I had time to talk myself out of it. I dried my hands on a dish towel that suddenly felt too thin. Why didn't you tell me right away?" "Because I knew I'd want to stay if I did." I looked away. My fingers clenched the fabric of the towel too tightly. He stepped closer, but not close enough to touch. "I don't regret any of this," he said. "But it's becoming a wound. And if I stay, I'll keep tearing it open." His words should have hurt, but they didn't, not in the way I expected. What hurt more was how right they sounded, how adult, how final. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, finally meeting his gaze. "I want you to figure out what you need. And if that's him, I'll respect it. But if it's not, don't stay out of habit. Don't lie to yourself because it's easier." I nodded once, not trusting myself to speak. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the steady breath of the man beside me. The man who had been good, loyal, present in all the right ways. I turned slightly, enough to see his profile in the moonlight. He looked peaceful, still, trusting, and I felt like a stranger in my own home. By morning, I had made a decision I couldn't take back. Not yet an action, but a shift. Something internal. A loosening. Of the ropes that had kept me bound to one version of myself, I rose before dawn, dressed quietly, and went down to the porch. He was already there, sitting with a suitcase by his feet, watching the sky pale at the edges. "You're early," I said. "So are you. We didn't say goodbye. We didn't need to." His eyes searched mine for a long moment, then dropped to my hand, still bare, fingers curled slightly at my side. He nodded once, a gesture that carried everything we hadn't had time to say. Then he stood, lifted his bag, and walked down the path without looking back. I stayed on the porch long after his car had disappeared down the street. My coffee cooled in my hand. My skin still remembered his heat. But inside, something else had started to cool too. Not regret, not clarity, just the faint, growing awareness that nothing would be the same again, and that I was the one who had changed it. The days after his departure stretched like wet linen on a clothesline. Heavy, slow to dry, clinging to the smallest breeze of memory, I moved through them as though underwater. Everything looked familiar, yet distant. I folded towels with machine precision, answered work emails with hollow enthusiasm, refilled the sugar jar though no one had asked. The motions anchored me. The emptiness inside me expanded quietly. My husband seemed relieved by the sudden return to normalcy. He didn't say it out loud, of course. He wasn't the type. But his expression softened. He stopped asking questions at breakfast. He didn't mention my restlessness or my silences. Perhaps he believed whatever had cracked in me had begun to seal. Perhaps he mistook absence for closure. But absence is not the same as peace. It's just quiet. And then came the envelope. It was Thursday afternoon, late. The sky was veiled in clouds. The kind that hover low and make everything feel smaller. The mail came, and among the usual clutter, catalogs, a bill, a dentist reminder, was a white, unmarked envelope with my name, written in that unmistakable handwriting, slanted clean European. I stood by the kitchen counter, holding it in both hands, my fingers pressing the edges, afraid to open, afraid not to. Inside was a single page, folded once, no greeting, no date, just a short message, printed, spare. I didn't stay because I didn't believe in us. I left because I did. I sat down slowly, the letter trembling in my hands. The weight of those words settled into my chest like stone. He wasn't begging. He wasn't manipulating. He had just offered me something, clean, one truth in a sea of half-lived conversations. I didn't tell my husband. I couldn't. Not because I was protecting the affair, but because I no longer trusted myself to speak about it without wanting it back. That night, as we got into bed, he turned to me, resting a hand on my waist under the blanket. His touch was gentle, a gesture he hadn't made in weeks. "I've missed you," he said, voice low. I didn't respond right away. The ceiling above us glowed faintly from the streetlight outside. I studied the shadows on the wall. My body tensed. Not in rejection, but in anticipation of the lie I'd have to deliver. "I've been here," I said finally, and hated how hollow the words sounded. He leaned in, kissing my shoulder. "I know, but sometimes it feels like you're not." There was no accusation, just observation, and it cut deeper than any suspicion would have. Later, when he fell asleep, I lay awake for hours, eyes wide, watching the ceiling. I replayed every scene, the porch, the garden, the back seat of the car where our legs had touched but never tangled, the kiss under the cedar tree, the silence of the drive home. I remembered the way his eyes had narrowed when he watched me speak. Not suspiciously, not possessively, but with full presence. That kind of attention lives on under your skin. It rearranges you. And suddenly I realized I wasn't mourning the end of the affair. I was mourning the return to invisibility. Next morning, I rose early, not to cook, not to clean, but to walk. I needed air, movement, proof of existence. I left a note on the counter. Went for a walk, back soon. I didn't go to the trail by the park. I didn't head toward the shops. Instead, I walked through the old part of town, where brick buildings leaned together like gossiping elders and the sidewalks cracked at the edges. I passed a closed cafe with dusty chairs still stacked inside, a thrift store window full of clocks, all telling different times. I ended up at a small train station I hadn't meant to find. I stood there, watching people board the morning line, each with a destination, each certain of where they needed to be. I hadn't felt that certainty in years. I sat on a bench and stared at the tracks until my coffee went cold in my hands. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to abandon my life. I just wanted to feel, truly feel, that I had a choice in it. That evening, my husband suggested we go away together. Maybe next weekend, just the two of us. That place you liked near the lake. I nodded, grateful for the thought, but something inside me recoiled. The idea of returning to a place filled with old memories, pretending to carve new ones on top. It felt like burying still warm embers under snow. I'll check my schedule, I said, and left it at that. He kissed me goodnight, lips brushing my temple. I lay in bed long after the lights were out, replaying the line from the letter. I left because I did. That sentence unraveled in my mind like thread, pulling at everything I had thought was neatly stitched. I turned it over again and again, not for hope, not for regret, but because it reminded me what it felt like to be wanted with such clarity that someone was willing to walk away, just to protect what he felt, and it struck me. My husband had never fought for me. Not really. He had preserved me, sheltered me, lived beside me. But the man who kissed me beneath the trees had seen the storm in me, and stepped into it. I didn't. I didn't touch the letter again. I just knew that I would never go back to who I was before it arrived. I began to notice the smallest things more acutely after the letter. The rhythm of footsteps on the staircase, the soft clink of a spoon in a ceramic cup, the moment of hesitation before my husband placed a hand on my back. Life had returned to its regular shape, but nothing sat quite right in it anymore. It felt like wearing a borrowed coat, familiar in cut, but slightly too tight in the sleeves. He didn't bring up the weekend away again. I think he could feel me pulling inward, like a tide that had decided it would no longer come to shore. He tried, in his way, setting the table early, texting me throughout the day just to check in, asking if I wanted to start reading a book together in the evenings. They were thoughtful gestures. They might have worked 6 months ago, but now they felt like applying makeup to a cracked mirror. It didn't fix the fracture. It just masked it, temporarily, and though I followed through with the dinners, the smiles, the surface conversations, I couldn't keep my hands from shaking when I was alone, not from fear, not even from longing, but from the weight of knowing that I had crossed into a life I could never unlive. I found myself rereading the letter in quiet corners of the day, once in the laundry room, with the door pulled nearly closed. Another time in the pantry, where I'd pretended to be reorganizing jars. I never cried when I read it, but my chest tightened in a way I didn't know how to explain, like a violin string pulled taut, waiting for sound that never came. The moment that undid me wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even about him. It came in the form of a single sentence spoken by my husband as we watched TV. "You seem better lately." I blinked slowly, careful not to react. "Better how?" "Just lighter, like you're sleeping more." "Less stressed," it was said with kindness. But what I heard underneath was everything he couldn't see. Everything I had managed to hide behind washed dishes and clean sheets and polite dinner conversations. That night I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, staring at my own eyes in the mirror. And I understood something I had avoided for weeks. I could stay, and nothing would collapse. My marriage would endure. My husband would continue to be stable, generous, warm in his way, but I would be quietly vanishing inside that comfort. I went to bed fully clothed and lay stiffly beside him, listening to his breath even out in sleep. And in that stillness, I began to draft a new kind of letter, not on paper, not with ink, but in the space of thought. It wasn't a farewell. It wasn't a confession. It was a kind of reckoning. It started with a simple truth. I was not fulfilled, and I no longer believed that pretending to be would protect anyone. The next morning, I went for a walk again. This time I didn't leave a note. I just stepped out into the morning fog and let my legs choose the direction. I wandered further than usual, through side streets I hadn't explored in years. I passed houses where curtains were still drawn, where front porches sagged under years of memory. I thought about the weight of choices we live with. Not the loud ones, but the quiet ones that settle deep and stay. At one point, I stopped in front of a small cafe. I didn't go in, just stood outside the window looking at the people inside. A couple sharing a pastry, an older man reading the paper alone, a young woman typing fiercely on her laptop. Earbuds in, their lives continued, quiet and separate, and I realized mine needed to too. Back at home, I began moving through rooms differently, not rushed, not frantic, just aware. I opened drawers I hadn't looked inside for years, found old photographs, receipts from restaurants that no longer existed, a half-burned candle that still smelled like orange blossom, and I began packing. Not suitcases, not yet, but thoughts, needs, truths I had refused to name out loud. That evening, I sat down with my husband. He was sipping a glass of wine, scrolling through a sports article on his tablet. "I need to say something," I told him. He looked up, his face already bracing for bad news, though he tried to hide it. "I've been dishonest," I said. "Not in the ways you think. I haven't lied. But I've withheld. From you, from myself." He waited. Silent. Listening. I've felt disconnected for a long time. Not because of anything you did, but because I stopped asking myself what I wanted. I stopped being present in my own life. He furrowed his brow slightly. And now I want to start asking again. And I don't know where that leads, but I know I can't pretend anymore that everything's fine. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Are you leaving?" "I don't know yet." Another long silence. Then he said quietly, "I wish you had told me sooner. I wish I had too." He didn't raise his voice, didn't plead, just sat there, looking not angry, but deeply, quietly hurt. We didn't talk more that night. We slept in the same bed, but it felt like a border had been drawn in the sheets. I lay awake again, staring into the dark. And for the first time, the guilt had been replaced by something else. Clarity. The affair had ended. The man had gone. But he had done what I hadn't. Been brave enough to do on my own. He had cracked the illusion. And in doing so, he'd handed me back my reflection. Now it was up to me to decide what to do with it. The following week unfolded with a strange kind of stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. There were no arguments, no emotional scenes, no dramatic exits or slammed doors. We moved around each other like people in a museum. Polite, restrained, careful not to touch anything too fragile. And yet, beneath the surface, everything had changed. We both knew it. My husband, in his own way, had understood more than I'd given him credit for. He had stopped asking questions, but his eyes had begun searching me differently, as if hoping to find the version of me he remembered hiding somewhere, behind the newer one who now moved through the rooms with deliberate distance. I spent my mornings in quiet reflection. Sometimes I walked. Other times, I simply sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the street empty and fill again with the rhythm of everyday life. Cars parked, neighbors passed, dogs barked at nothing. The world did what it always did. Kept going, and I realized so would I. But going forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant understanding, accepting that love, even in its quietest forms, could evolve into something that no longer served either person. I didn't hate my husband. I didn't resent him. In some ways, that made it harder. There was no clean wound to dress, no betrayal to point to. Just two people who had grown in opposite directions while keeping up the appearance of standing still. One evening after dinner, he sat across from me at the table, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug. He hadn't sipped from. "I've been thinking," he said. I looked up, but said nothing. "I don't want to live in a house where I feel like a guest." I let the silence stretch, then said, "Neither do I." He nodded once, as if he'd been preparing for that answer. "Then maybe we need to figure out what comes next. Separately." There was no anger in his voice, just resignation, and beneath it, perhaps, a kind of relief. That night, we didn't sleep in the same bed. I took the guest room for the first time since his mother had visited years ago. The sheets were too crisp, the mattress unfamiliar. But I slept deeply. For the first time in weeks, in the morning, he made coffee before I came downstairs. The air smelled like cinnamon toast and compromise. We sat on opposite ends of the kitchen island, sipping quietly, no longer pretending we were okay. Later that day, I called a realtor. I didn't tell him, not yet, but I asked questions, took notes. I opened closets I hadn't touched in years, wondering what I would keep, what I would leave behind. And that night, I finally did something I had been avoiding. I pulled out the letter one last time. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing the crease with the edge of my palm. The ink hadn't faded, though the paper had begun to soften with time and rereading. I read the words aloud, barely louder than a whisper. I didn't stay because I didn't believe in us. I left because I did. I folded it again, not into an envelope, but into a small, worn square I placed in the back of my journal, not because I needed to hold on to him, but because I needed to hold on to who I was when I read it the first time. The woman who realized she was not broken, just lost, and that loss wasn't permanent. It was a map. Days turned into weeks. He and I spoke more practically, about logistics, about timelines, about what would go and what would stay. There were no blowouts, just gentle unraveling. And yet, in the quiet moments, I still thought about the garden, the cedar bench, the way the breeze had caught the hem of my blouse the day he kissed me. I didn't romanticize it. I didn't chase it. But I honored it, because that kiss hadn't destroyed anything. It had revealed something. That I was still capable of wanting, still capable of being wanted. The final morning before the movers arrived, I stood in the doorway of what had once been our bedroom. The bed had been stripped, the furniture, tagged with stickers for sorting. I stood for a long time, remembering the hundreds of nights I had slept there, both with someone and still alone. I walked outside barefoot onto the porch, where the early sun had already begun to warm the planks. The garden was quiet, overgrown now, but still beautiful in its neglect. I sat on the bench beneath the cedar, the same one where I'd once pressed my lips to a man who had, without knowing it, changed the trajectory of my life. Not because he loved me, but because he saw me. And now, I was learning to do the same. I didn't cry. I didn't look back when I finally stood and walked inside. Some stories don't end with grand gestures. Some end with a woman finally choosing herself. Quietly, completely, and maybe, just maybe, that was the real beginning.